What often happens is because the process is either undocumented or not documented properly, we leave people to their own devices. And, not saying that they're not trying to do their best, but if you don't have a process, you're going to get inconsistent outcomes.
Welcome to Making Better, a podcast from Better Everyday Studios devoted to helping small learning teams have a big impact. Today we are talking with MJ Hurley, Executive Trainer at Hurley Write. One of the biggest barriers to effective training is a lack of documentation for what we are trying to train. Documentation happens to be MJ's specialty, so that is what we were going to talk about today.
MJ, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Doing great, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. I'm so excited to have you. As I told you earlier, so we met several months ago through LinkedIn, and a few weeks ago, I was having a discussion with a friend of mine about documentation inside a company. It made me want to do a podcast about it. And as soon as I thought that, I knew I needed to talk to you. So thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. I can't believe you're talking to your friend about documentation. That's like not
it's
an exciting conversation, but hey.
I know it often isn't, but for people in training, in learning and development, it is just so often our Achilles heel, because we get asked to solve a problem for a team, and we go there and say, like, okay, how do you want me to train this team? What do you want me to train them to do? And they have no documentation. They haven't sat down to figure out what right looks like.
Right.
And so that's what I wanted to talk to you about. If you could give a quick introduction to yourself of why it makes sense that we are talking about this subject, because I think you're the perfect person for this.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. So my name's MJ Hurley. I'm a part of a certified woman-owned small business. Our company is called Hurley Write. My mom started the company about 35 years ago. She has a PhD in technical writing, and she started this from the ground up, and I've learned everything I know pretty much from her. The joke I always make is when you have a parent who is a PhD in technical writing, you kind of also have a PhD in technical writing, because every document you've ever submitted your entire life has been scrutinized and reviewed, and so you pick up a lot along the way. But in terms of SOPs, I think it's one of those things. It's one of those things that we think we're doing it well until we realize we're not. And most people don't really know what a good SOP looks like. And to your point earlier about, kind of this idea of a standard and what's good, what's not good, a lot of it is just starts becoming bias and one person's opinion versus another, which, isn't really rooted in long-term behavior and long-term success.
Yeah. I think that's 100% right. And so, so standard operating procedures is what we're talking about, SOPs. Really, really important for I come from a military background, and that's what everything is SOPs. It's how we operate.
Right.
When you say SOP, what do you think of? What are the things that come to your mind? Or when somebody says, do I need SOPs? Like what are you describing to them, and what makes you think they need it?
That's a great question. We've heard them. I feel like that term's interchangeable depending on the organization. People call them work instructions, and
sure.
We have different definitions. But at the end of the day, it's just it's what it is, what it says it is, right? It's a process where we all agree this is the way that things must get done. And I think we see them most often in organizations that deal with heavy machinery or drug production. The idea is that we're trying to create a process that generates the exact same outcome every single time without getting people hurt and without damaging any equipment. I think one of the big problems that most people have is that not only do they not know how to write an SOP, but there's often kind of no oversight into when it's done well versus not when it's done well. There's often not double checking to make sure it actually does what it says it does. So there's a whole host of issues, but at the end of the day, it's just, we're trying to create this process, as we grow a team, as we want to empower people to act individually so that we can entrust them and say, hey, this is the way this process must be done to ensure that we're getting the same result, saving ourselves time, money, heartache, and, ultimately not hurting people or hurting equipment.
Yeah, it's So anytime you have kind of that repeatable process, are there, like you mentioned, making sure people don't get hurt. I think most people would understand in these, like construction environments or hazardous environments. Are there other kind? I think we talked before about there's other kinds of places where people have used SOPs effectively that maybe aren't like life critical, but still business critical.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that we talked about, kind of a sales process, what are these internal processes look like? Who do I need to hand it off to? When do I need to hand it off to? When do I have to do afterwards? And I think a lot of it, what often happens is because the process is either undocumented or not documented properly, we leave people to their own devices, and, not saying that they're not trying to do their best, but it starts becoming an issue with, well, hey, who'd you give that to? I gave it to Susie. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to give it to Bill. And it's like, oh, well, Susie, and so people kind of start doing their own thing. And then it's, I think one of the things I always try to get people to think about really with most work activities is if you don't have a process, you're going to get inconsistent outcomes. And that's one of the things we're often trying to avoid. And people often come to us and say, why is this consistently happening? Not the way it's supposed to. And it says, either we haven't taught them how to follow the process, or it's not clear what the process is. So if you're dissatisfied with the inconsistency of the outcome, we need to take a look at the process. And to your point, we often take a look and like, oh, there is no process. We just kind of told them, what to do. And now everyone's just kind of doing their own thing.
Yeah, exactly. So when companies come to you, is there a common theme of when they come to you? Are they seeing lots of those mistakes that you mentioned, or are they kind of just realizing that they might need documentation? When do people normally start?
Sure. Yeah. I feel like people come to us after a problem has reared its head. It's rare that someone comes to us beforehand and is preventative. I've had some horror stories with, people getting their arms stuck in things and hospital visits. And, we wrecked a $150,000 piece of machinery because they didn't follow something correctly. And, a lot of people we deal with too, is, you have audits from regulatory agencies, FDA and things like that. So not only are they trying to keep people safe, but they're also not trying to get fined. And, with like some of our pharmaceutical clients, if I've had a couple of stories where the SOPs are written so poorly, the FDA audit, the auditor couldn't find what they needed to, and they actually shut the drug down, which is millions and millions of dollars worth of research and product development and everything else. So it's depending on the organization, it's quite a big deal. I'd say in those situations, they're aware of what a sizable problem it is. We have other organizations where it's something has happened or almost has happened, and it's like, oh, we need to take a second look at what we got going on here. So I'd say most of the time it's post-catastrophe, not pre-catastrophe. Yeah,
that makes sense. I think it very parallels with the training world as well.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah. And I think, one of the struggles that a lot of, especially, early companies have and growing companies is that, any company that gets started is always started by people who really like figuring things out,
right?
Or they wouldn't start a company,
right?
And then and at the start of a company, everything needs to be figured out. There is no standard,
right?
And then the challenge is making that realization of, oh, now there are some things that we've figured out, and it's okay to like take a minute to pause and write down what are the things we've figured out so we don't have to refigure them out.
Yes, right.
But the challenge is a lot of the people who are leading the company just don't think that way.
No.
It's just not how they're wired. So what are you've mentioned some of them already, with things not being standardized, just things not looking right. Like when you look at when somebody comes to you and hands you the SOPs that they have, what are just some of the, immediate, like top 3 just glaring red flags that you see? I mean, if it's not top 3, what are the big things you see?
That's a great question. I think the most obvious ones lots of times is there are just steps missing, because I think it's often written from the perspective of a very smart person. And there's something called it's called the bias of knowledge. And it's this idea that I assume because I know something that you also know it. And so it's a blind spot lots of times for us as writers.
Mm-hmm.
If we're writing for a person, teaching them how to do something, they don't have that background, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't need the SOP to begin with. Yeah. So there's this often assumption that you kind of have an idea as to what I'm talking about, and not every step is always outlined like it should be. That's a really big one. The other big one is just people not knowing how to write steps. Steps, typically it's, you start with a verb, it's one step and it's one step only. And lots of times we'll see people write, complete paragraphs under a step. Multiple things are trying to be covered. Sometimes they're not even steps at all. It's just purely informational. And at the end of the day, one of the things that I think we do a good job is thinking about the usability of a document. It's about making it easy for you to be able to follow along. And if I have to read through it and I can't figure out what I'm supposed to do, obviously that represents problems. So those are the big three for, I think it's just assumption of knowledge. The steps aren't clearly laid out. And often it's just kind of a fire hose approach where we throw everything at you. And sometimes it's usable, sometimes it's not.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then when it comes to those kinds of challenges, what are the best ways to fix it? We can kind of take them one at a time. You kind of start with that whole idea of the assumption of knowledge.
Sure.
When you're training people, how do you break that for them? How do you get them to get out of that mode?
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest problems, frankly, and this is, I think, across all documentation, not even necessarily SOPs, where, I think one or two things happen. People intrinsically, we love to write for ourselves. And I know people hearing that and they're like, what does that mean? But we rarely don't take the time to really and truly think about what it is that this reader actually needs. I have clients all the time where it's like, well, we wrote 20 pages. And it's like, of all this material, there's 2 paragraphs that the reader actually cares about. So we start talking and speaking because we think this is interesting, or I think this is cool, or I think this sounds good. That's a really popular one.
Yeah.
We write to make it sound good. Well, it's not about sounding good. It's about doing a job. And so this whole concept of knowing your audience, we hear it all the time, but I think most people don't know or take the time or don't know how to target that audience. So, I think for us, it's getting them to be more mindful of what it is readers actually need. What is it that reader actually wants? If you were picking this up in their shoes, what would you be looking for? You don't necessarily care about when the business was founded. You care about the steps that I need to be able to execute whatever this action is. So I think that's a huge blind spot for a lot of people, is just this lack of awareness of how to actually target an audience. And then the other piece is a lot of it just comes down to readability studies and usability. How do we meet this metric? How do we meet this standard? This is the expectation. This is what readers expect. Now it's our job to meet that standard so that we can make it as easy as possible for them.
On that note, that knowing what people expect,
right?
Is that part of earlier before we started recording? We were talking a lot about standardization of this kind of stuff. Is that part of that too, where it's just like where certain things fall in the document, so that
absolutely
where to go?
Absolutely. It's really I think it's interesting. I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to this stuff, but I think it's fascinating, kind of the human process of reading, and there's a lot of good data out there that, in my opinion, can be leveraged to help us make better decisions. How readers read, what readers expect. Because at the end of the day, I think one of the biggest misunderstandings that writers often have is that we assume, I worked really hard on this, I'm going to put it in front of you, and you're going to sit down and read every single word of it. And that is just straight up not true anymore. Readers don't do that. Most readers choose not to read, and if they choose to read, they often choose to skim. So being mindful of what that looks like and how to do that better is really going to ultimately drive the conclusion we need them to come to. Because I think it's just that assumption that, well, here it is, I did it, and dig in. And it's like, no, I'm not doing that. Especially we start seeing processes that get too long or too unwieldy. I had a client the other day. It's like, we have this 120-page SOP and no one's getting through it. Like, I know why. And so how do we make this more palatable, more usable? And, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. It's not about checking a box saying we did it. It's about having someone be able to do something.
Yeah, making it useful. I mean, it's every time I talk to you, I'm always amazed at just the parallels between writing and training. Good technical writing and good training, and it's all what are we trying to achieve, and then just doing the absolute minimum to achieve that. Anything else is fluff.
Yep,
and you get rid of it.
And the strategies of staying focused and setting that goal, and is it measurable, and all these fun things. Absolutely. And it's, we align it a lot to problem solving. Writing, in our opinion, is problem solving. And it's the kind of same world that you're in, right? You're trying to solve a problem. And what are the steps that are necessary to solve it?
Yep, absolutely. So on steps, that was the second thing you mentioned. Was the second problem that you often see is not having each step be one thing.
Right.
You just kind of do a big chunk of stuff.
Yeah,
And I
right.
do think it can be challenging because I think that's how humans learn, right? That's what skill is.
Right.
Skill is chunking things together so that when I started riding a bike, like putting my foot on the pedal and pressing down
Right.
was like a separate action from like keeping the handlebars straight.
Right.
And then as I got better, it's all just like riding a bike.
Yeah, right. Then it's all,
And
and that's a great analogy, right? So if you go write an SOP today and teach someone how to ride a bike, you might be like, sit down and start pedaling. It's like, well, that might be 25 steps for a 3-year-old who's just learning, right? So it's that whole thing. I always like the analogy of, if you ask a 40-year-old mother of 2 to write an SOP on how to make a peanut butter jelly sandwich for herself versus teaching her kids how to make one. Those are going to be much different processes, right? I'm going to have to teach the kid, probably have to get a step ladder, probably have to teach them how to use a knife, where the knives are located, how to open a drawer, but for her, you don't need to tell her all that, go grab the knife, open the jar, stick the peanut butter in. But, that's probably 40 steps for a 4-year-old. So, again, the part of it too is just a recognition of audience. Who are we actually writing it for? And then how do we actually meet the need of that person? And I think a lot of the SOPs that we see are just incredibly generic with no specific reader in mind. So it may or may not be, actually even meeting the need of the intended user itself.
Are there best practices that you recommend for making sure are you taking the SOP to the end user and having them test it before you finalize? Like what are some different things you can do?
Absolutely. I mean, so I'm a huge advocate of getting someone familiar to review it, but also someone who's unfamiliar. I think some of the best piece of feedback is often from the person who has no idea how to operate the machine or the process. I think so much time we handed that person, and this is often how most organizations check, where it's like, I wrote it, let me write it for the other, let me see if the other SME agrees. They do, great, we're moving on. And that usually isn't very thorough. It makes sense to me, but the whole point is we're not writing for you. We're writing for someone who has no idea how to
feel like there's a whole thing that way to get HR and other support teams more involved with a company of just have a standard process for all SOPs or technical writing, just goes through the HR team or something and has somebody, because they have no idea what's happening over there, and it gets them more integrated with the business and exposes them to all kinds of cool stuff, and it will help the documentation. I like that idea, actually. I mean, because I often say, I feel like, the training team's role is to be the dumb person in the room.
Yeah.
Like that's why we're brought in.
Yeah. Be curious, ask questions, turn over every stone. I agree with you. And again, I think, lots of times it's that's where a lot of the benefit comes from, right? Because there's so many assumptions being made from the person who's already knowledgeable that we just frankly miss stuff. Not on purpose, of course, but it's just a lack of insight.
Yeah. And then the final flag that I think you mentioned was about readability, just kind of general readability. So what do you advise for that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, to me, usability, with every document, it needs to have the point is that people need to be able to pick it up and use it and understand it and ultimately execute. And so, there's a lot of different ways that that's achieved. I think one of the most telling thing in particular is, we've seen it in front matter where we don't give the reader a heads up and what could be dangerous or what tools to use or what the safety precautions are, what the standards are. Sometimes it's even something as simple as a bad title where we say it's, we're going to teach you how to make a birthday cake and it's actually about riding a bike. And so I know that's a bad analogy, but you get into it and you realize, I'm in the wrong place. Or it's a collection of SOPs. That's really common where, that lengthy one that we talked about, the 120 pagers, that's really, it was a collection of 7 or 8 different SOPs. And so, we're making people just work too hard. And I think to me, we always have to understand the human behavior side of reading. And readers are always, or I shouldn't say always, in most cases, going to try to find ways out of it. Most people don't enjoy reading. So we have to constantly be aware of kind of these decisions that they're making, how they're making it, and how do we make it as easy as possible for them to do what it is we need them to do. If we create obstacles for them, they're just going to put it down and go ask their colleague, hey, how do you do this thing? And that's where we start getting into trouble.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and it sounds like for all three of those things, like really what it comes down to is two essential elements of what's the outcome you're trying to achieve and who is your target audience.
Yeah. Those are good. I tell people all the time, writing comes down to two things: who you're writing for and what do you want them to do. And if you can drill that in and make that clear and then start measuring it, you're going to be in really good shape.
Perfect. One other thought I had and question, I don't know if you touch on this with folks, organization and storage. That's always the thing that I feel like I see a lot where maybe I don't know about how good their SOPs are. Like maybe they have them, maybe they don't, but they're all over the place.
Yeah.
And nobody can find them.
Yeah.
Is that a common problem that you see?
Yeah.
Do you have any advice?
It's funny. I have a call tomorrow with the group. We've been doing some work with a pharmaceutical group. I'm not going to share their names. I don't want to get them in trouble, but it's every SOP has basically they're saying the problem is no one wants to write them. So it's just a hyperlink to another document. And so you're just going down this rabbit hole, click, 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 click until you find something useful. And then oftentimes you're in the wrong place. And so you got to kind of go back out and try it again. So there are, I feel like, unfortunately, a lot of shortcuts being made. And, again, it's that problem where it's not a problem today, but if someone gets hurt or if we get audited, we have a huge problem on our hands. And so it's always that way, right? It's always that way with everything. We're going to kick the can until we run into that, that fire. And then we're like, oh no, we should have done something about this.
That is the big challenge for both of our spaces is
right.
It's always tomorrow's problem.
Yeah. And seeing what's it costing you today versus what's it going to cost you in a year from now. And, is it worth paying $1 today, or do you want to pay $1 million a year from now? That's kind of the question sometimes. But again, maybe it won't happen. Maybe I don't have to pay $1 million a year. I'll take the gamble. But yeah, so that's the world that we live in. It's an interesting one. For sure.
So do you have any have you seen any good best practices for storage then, or is it just kind of like it depends on the situation?
I haven't really for storage. A lot of people have kind of their own internal SharePoint or whatever. So that's usually kind of not the world that we live in. And I did actually have two organizations. One, they digitized all of their SOPs to basically make it like a click through, or for a while there, was actual physical, manuals. And I thought that was interesting. They're on like the manufacturing floor and they're able to click through it and, it would make the decision for them, like what the next step was. So that was pretty cool. And I actually saw one client, they transferred, which I thought was really smart. They transferred all their SOPs and made them all into videos. And I thought that was interesting, right? Because again, think about usability. Sometimes it's easier for me to show you something versus me sitting down and having to write it out for you. I thought that was smart, but I haven't, no one's really talked to me too much about their storage issues, which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Cause I don't know if I could help them too much.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I want to be cognizant of your time. So any last thoughts you have on, if there was one main tip you could give, you've already given a lot, but when it comes to getting started with documentation or helping a company with documentation, do you have any final parting tips?
I think one of the biggest things is have a standard in place, right? The organization, we got to, as a unit, agree what we're trying to accomplish and the best way to accomplish it so that we can start streamlining and standardizing it. And, a lot of organizations, we don't do that till later. And there's a tremendous amount of frustration that comes around from the writer's perspective, where they're saying, well, no matter what I submit, it comes back in a pool of red ink. And the reviewer saying they're not listening to my feedback and it's taking too long to get things done. So standardize as early as possible, and that should save you a ton of heartache. Yeah,
for sure. Awesome. Well, thank you for being on the show. Really appreciate the time. I thought it was a great discussion, and have a great rest of your day.
All right, you as well. Thank you, Matt.